Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett along with Kent Myers. We're here every week meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues. And today we're going to bring in an old friend to talk about a new book.
Yes, we are. Kent Frates has been on the show a couple of times before. He's got a rich background and does everything he wants to do. He does well, but he's a lawyer. He's been in the House of Representatives. And most recently, he has become a well-recognized author, and he's written a new book about Oklahoma's most notorious court cases. And he's going to come talk to us about that book, and we're going to delve into some of these cases. I think it's fascinating. I've read 2 or 3 of the chapters already. It's a great read, and we're really pleased Kent would come join us.
Everything from Machine Gun Kelly to
Oklahoma City bombing,
to the Governor David Hall, to the Sirloin Stockade murders, as they were called at the time. A lot of really interesting cases that I think some people will remember.
Murders, yeah.
Absolutely. It's coming up today on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
One of the reasons why I moved to Rockaway is because it's such a diverse culture and different ethnicities. And my camera has opened some doors to really meet people that I probably wouldn't have gotten to meet without it. I'm Beth Perkins, I'm a professional photographer, and I'm Chickasaw. It came in as like a mini tidal wave. Everything sustainable had just disappeared in one swoop, and I just underestimated this power, and I realized really how little we are in this whole scheme of things and how quickly things can go bad. My community is still rebuilding, and for them to just show up out of the blue and just start clearing out my house was, I'm not one that likes to ask for help. So for someone to come and do that for me it was really touching and humbling. I've thought about the history of the Chickasaws and what they went through as far as relocating and losing their homes and having to rebuild and to thrive in the end after all of that is just a true testament to the Chickasaw strength. And I try and draw from that and remember that that's a part of who I am.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
People have been talking about energy independence for a long time. It's always been popular, but today it's possible.
We have an enormous supply of oil and gas in the United States, much more than we thought just a few years ago.
New technology, massive new discoveries, largely made by Oklahoma companies. It literally changes everything.
And Oklahoma is leading the charge. Go watch this video to see why. Energy independence starts with us.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
We've had a lot of guests on this show, and some of them I have known before they came on the show, others I met as they came on the show. This fellow that's joined us today, Kent Frates, I've known for many, 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 many years, clear back to college days. Kent did his undergraduate work at Stanford University, did his law work both at Oklahoma City University and at the University of Arizona. He was a Republican member of the House of Representatives when there weren't very many of them. And happened to be minority leader at the time he served in the House for a number of years. He's a rather prolific writer of articles, essays, and books. He's been on our show a time or two before discussing one of his books or some of his activities. He's always a good guest. We're always pleased to have him back. And he's written a new book now called Oklahoma's Most Notorious Cases. Kent, we're really glad to have you back. Welcome back to The Verdict.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. I'm excited about this book myself. What inspired you to take on the job of these famous criminal cases in Oklahoma and decided that they needed the retelling?
Well, first of all, I had done another book called Oklahoma Courthouse Legends, and I'd done a lot of research for that book, which has a story about every county related to the courthouse. many of them are trials or cases.
And we did a show on that book.
You did. And I had done a lot of research on certain ones, and there were others, like the Machine Gun Kelly case that I'd written historical articles on before. And looking around, I just hadn't seen a book exactly like this, so I thought maybe that people would be interested in hearing what I hope is, in some cases, the inside story of these cases.
Let's jump right in then to a generation who doesn't know Machine Gun Kelly was a gangster in the 1930s. We have a newspaper headline as you kind of tell the story. What's famous about this particular story?
Well, Machine Gun Kelly was one of the wave of criminals, bank robbers, and kidnappers that swept across the country as a result of the Depression. And in 1933, he kidnapped an Oklahoma City oil man named Charles Urschel, who lived in Heritage Hills, and held him for ransom for what was the then unheard of sum of $200,000, which would be like about between $3 and $4 million now. The ransom was paid, Urschel was released, but largely due to Urschel's photographic memory, courage, and intelligence, he collected clues that led to the capture and conviction of the entire Kelly gang, and ultimately put Machine Gun Kelly and the rest of his gang in jail for life and ended their crime career. But the most important thing about it was that it was a case of many firsts, and most importantly, it was the first big case that the FBI had. Before that, they were little-known investigators for the Justice Department, and this case put them on the map. And it was the first case that was tried under the Lindbergh kidnapping law. It was the first case where they allowed movie cameras in a courtroom, which happened right here in Oklahoma City in the courtroom that still exists in the old federal courthouse. It was the first case where they ever transported a suspect by airplane. They flew Kelly back here after they arrested him in Memphis. And so for that, all those reasons, it was a historic case nationwide as well as in Oklahoma.
Well, you have a little closer connection to that case than most Oklahomans.
I do, because the victim, Charles Urschel, was my uncle by marriage. And so I had heard this story, of course, all my life from my family. And Charles himself didn't like to talk about it very much. And I didn't get too much information from him during his lifetime until I was stationed in San Antonio in the Air Force. And he was nice enough to have me over for lunch or take me out to play golf at his house or something. And once in a while then he would talk about the case. So I did have some information that no one else was privy to, yeah.
Well, you also did a chapter in your book, or a series of chapters in your book, on the Girl Scout murders. Talk about the Jean Leroy Hart case. Tell us about that.
Well, that was at the time a very high-profile case, and I liken it very much to the O.J. Simpson case, because it was a case where there was a suspect that was charged, and many people thought he was guilty. Many people thought that he was guilty, but in fact, after a trial, he was found not guilty. So it was one of those cases where, for one reason or another, the system of justice fails. Either he was guilty and found not guilty, or they never found the real criminal.
Well, nobody's been convicted of those murders
yet.
No
one has ever been convicted of them, and no one else was charged.
Well, is today there DNA opportunities to determine whether or not he committed it?
At the time, there was no DNA. And subsequently, years later, when DNA became available, they ran 3 different DNA tests on his DNA at different times, run by different people, laboratories in the OSBI and so forth. And as the time passed, the samples got so degraded that they were not conclusive, but they were all inconclusive. Both the prosecutors and the OSBI and the defense claim that they proved either innocence or guilt, because in a DNA test you have to meet, I believe it's 7 different markers, and they met part of those markers, but not all of them. So the only real answer is that the DNA tests were inconclusive. They didn't prove.
What is your assessment of the major reason or reasons that he was found not guilty?
Well, they couldn't prove it. The jurors just didn't believe the witnesses, and there was some evidence that there was evidence planted. There was a local judge named, sheriff named Pete Weaver, and he hated Hart. And the reason he hated Hart was Hart had been convicted of crimes and had been in McAllister, but 5 years before this crime, or about 4.5 years, he was brought back to Mays County and put in the jail. Well, he escaped, and then he turned himself in after a few weeks, and then he escaped again. And he was on the run for 4.5 years, and he made a laughingstock out of the sheriff. Everybody would say, well, I saw Gene down at the supermarket or something. He couldn't catch him. And he was hiding out in the woods over there, and he was a Cherokee. And the Cherokees, there were some Cherokee homeboys that helped protect him. And so there was some evidence that Weaver might have planted evidence against him, but there was evidence against him, but on the other hand, there was a flashlight that was left at the scene of the crime that had a fingerprint. It wasn't his. There was a bloody footprint in the tent of the little girls that were killed. It wasn't his footprint. So there was certainly reasonable doubt as to whether he did the crime. I didn't mention the crime was horrible. It was an 8, 9, and 10-year-old girls were brutally murdered and molested at a Girl Scout camp right outside of Locust Grove.
And an equally horrific crime, this what's called the Sirloin Stockade murders. You might briefly describe that. We've got about a minute for our next break.
Okay. Well, the Sirloin Stockade murders was the biggest mass murder in the state prior to the Oklahoma City bombing. And it took place in South Oklahoma City at a Sirloin Stockade restaurant located at Southwest 74th and Southwestern in Oklahoma City. And that's sort of a summary of it. I don't know how far we're to the break, but anyway.
Well, they put the workers into the freezer and then.
Correct. There were 6 people killed. Yeah. There were 6 people killed. 4 of them were under 18 years old. Just typical restaurant workers in their age. I mean, you know, the people were working there for the summer and that sort of thing. And the killers marched them into the freezer, which was a little bit bigger than maybe a big storeroom, and assassinated all of them, shot them to death in a matter of probably less than a minute.
Well, and it was a crime spree that took place over a few days by this husband, wife, and brother, as I recall.
They tied it to another crime, which actually had taken place a few weeks before. And it was a carjacking that happened down by Purcell. And there was a family of 2 Air Force sergeants, husband and wife, and a 12-year-old boy. And they were all killed, and their truck was stolen down by Purcell. And eventually it turned out that the same people had perpetrated both the crimes. The same criminals had done both the crimes.
And of course your book chronicles the story, but also the trials, and we're going to get more with Kent Frates on what he's calling Oklahoma's most notorious cases. It's his new book. We'll be right back on The Verdict.
When you have something important to communicate, it becomes clear that there's a lot of competition for your audience's attention. So how can your message stand out and actually resonate with your audience? Legal Graphics has the answers. The team at Legal Graphics will work with you to plan, design, and even test your presentation to ensure your message will be heard and remembered. Call Legal Graphics today to schedule an appointment. The readiness is all.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. We are visiting with Kent Frates, who has a new book called Oklahoma's Most Notorious Cases. Kent?
Yeah, Kent, let's go back to the Sirloin Stockade. Tell us a little bit about how they were caught, how the defendants were caught.
Well, that's extremely interesting because this is a case that does great credit to the police force of Oklahoma City and the OSBI. It was a case where there were virtually no clues, and they had to dig up the information and solve the crime. This is like one of these TV dramas, only better because it's real. And they also, however, were helped by the bizarre personality of one of the perpetrators, whose name was Roger Dale Stafford, who was the principal killer involved. But when they started the case, they only had two clues, and that was that someone had seen a green station wagon parked behind the restaurant at the time of the killings, and then the assistant manager who was killed, his watch was missing, which they never put that out to the public. They held that back, but it turned out neither one of those clues came to anything. But what had happened, they finally related this case to the carjacking case that I mentioned that happened down near Purcell, killed a family named Lorenz. And after they did that, they remembered that after the Lorenz killing, there had been some drawings done by Harvey Pratt, who's a very famous forensic artist at the OSBI and also an artist himself. And he had done some sketches of what the people would have looked like that were supposedly seen with the Lorenz truck, but they had never put them out to the public. So finally, when they were getting nowhere after about 6 months, they decided to put those not photographs, but drawings out, and they did. They ran them on television, and they got like 400 responses, people saying they'd seen them or knew who they were and blah, blah, blah. Well, one of those responses was from a truck driver who refused to identify himself, but he said, I don't know who the third person is, but two of those people are Verna Stafford and Harold Stafford. And that would have been the wife and the brother of Roger Dale Stafford. Well, later, when they finally used those clues to catch Roger Dale Stafford, and later when they were interviewing, they found out that he was the person who called in. He was drunk, and he was trying to pin it on his wife, who he was then separated from, and his brother, who was then deceased.
He was mad about that.
Yeah, right, and he was going to pin it on somebody else. So he led at a certain part to his own.
If he hadn't made that call, we
demise. Might not have happened.
Let's switch to another big case, and that is the trial of David Hall, the Oklahoma governor.
Right. That case, there's sort of what I tried to do in this book. There are lots of other cases that you could include, of course. I don't think anybody would dispute that these cases are notorious. I mean, but there are plenty of other notorious cases. But what I tried to do was pick cases that there was something interesting about even beyond the trial. First of all, they had to have a trial. If they didn't have a trial, then I didn't include them in the book. But David Hall was just a interesting story of a very, very successful, very charismatic politician who rose to the top very quickly and fell very quickly due to his own corrupt nature. While he was governor and after he was elected and even before he took office, he started soliciting bribes from people. And he used intermediaries, but they were oftentimes clumsy. And over a period of time, the 4 years he was governor, he received many monies from several different sources. In order to catch him, after this became apparent and after he approached the Secretary of State, whose name was John Rogers, John Rogers was wired, and he had conversations with David Hall and collected tapes which were supervised by the FBI. And eventually Hall was prosecuted and convicted of bribery in the U.S. District Court in Oklahoma City.
And who was the prosecutor in his case?
Well, the prosecutor in that case was Bill Burkett, and I should mention that in the Sirloin Stockade case, it was Andy Coates, who was also the mayor of Oklahoma City, who was the dean of the OU Law School and who ran for the United States Senate and was a very, very accomplished trial lawyer. In fact, Andy said, well, that wasn't even my most notorious case, he told me. He liked the case where he represented the University of Oklahoma in the television antitrust case against he and I think it was Georgia that broke what was a monopoly on football games. On TV.
Television stranglehold.
Right.
Well, insofar as David Hall case is concerned, he was impeached while he was convicted and impeached?
No, there was an effort to impeach him. There was an investigation of a committee that was trying to lead to impeaching him. And I was in the legislature at the time, and there was a vote on that, and there were 9 of us that voted to impeach him, and 80 some odd that voted not to. and interestingly enough, the person who led that effort to impeach him in the legislature was Frank Keating. And also interestingly, coincidentally, Frank Keating represented one of the other criminal defendants in the David Hall case, who pled guilty and flipped on David Hall.
Was that vote along party lines?
Yeah, well, yes it was, yeah.
Also in this, the Oklahoma City bombing, is this the federal trial that took place in Denver or the Nichols trial that took place in McAllister?
That's a real good question. When I had obviously that's the most notorious case in the history of the state, unfortunately for bad reasons. But when I addressed it, I tried to figure out some way to address it that hadn't been addressed, which was virtually impossible. There had been, as you probably know, many books, documentary films, investigations by private organizations. There's just worlds and worlds of information on that. But what hadn't been particularly addressed was the state trial that took place in McAllister of Nichols, the second Nichols trial. So I covered in the book, I covered the whole circumstances and the history of the case, the evidence. And I cover all 3 of the trials.
20 seconds left.
I cover all 3 of the trials, but I tried to focus on that trial because it hadn't been covered before.
Yeah, in fact, I attended that trial. I remember in 2004.
That's right. That's correct.
Judge Steve Taylor was the judge.
Yes, he was.
Let's hold up the book one more time because I think this is going to be very popular amongst our viewers. Kent Frates' book, Oklahoma's Most Notorious Cases. Kent, we really appreciate you coming on this show.
On the stand for purchase when?
In November.
In November?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
And it's available online now, yeah.
Okay.
Kent and I'll have a final word after this.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
You have children come from a different lifestyle, different mindset. You have to open your arms and really do what you have to do to have that child become a part of your family. And if it's more patience, that's what you do. Kids gotta know they can trust you. And that's what we've tried to do with these kids.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
We are back on The Verdict, wrapping up a show with Kent Frates and his book, Oklahoma's Most Notorious Cases.
Yeah, Kent's a great author, a very fine friend for many, many years, but I'm really intrigued with the way he's handled these cases that are known to a lot of us who've lived in Oklahoma all our lives, but perhaps a lot of folks haven't and aren't familiar with it. If you want to get a good handle on what happened in our most notorious cases, pick up the book. It's a really, really good read.
There is a website with that name, oklahomasmostnotoriouscases.com, but you can also find it in your typical online opportunities, and I'm sure more opportunities will be coming soon. We also have a website. We'd love for you to go to our website. Tell us about a guest you'd like to see or a subject you'd like to see discussed. It's theverdict.tv. For purposes of, I thought, you know, it's a great example of what research can find. And there's so many great stories out there. I think we're indebted to Kent for telling these stories one more time.
Well, yes, and one thing he mentions in his book, that there were a number of cases that he was not able to put in just from space limitation purposes.
Sounds like a sequel.
But for instance, well, we may see another one, you never know. Jerome Ursuline and a number of other cases like that. That were high profile but not able to be included, but the ones that have been included are complete and are thorough and you can understand them.
And we'll have that on another show. We'll see you next week.